Florida Live, Dan Maduri broadcasting across the I-4 corridor. It looks like there's going to be plenty of blame to go around for the crash of that Germanwings jet in the Alps. We now know that Lufthansa, which owns Germanwings, knew about co-pilot Andreas Lubitz's depression. And it also seems doctors didn't do enough to help Lubitz with his mental condition that he feared would end his flying career. With us to talk about the latest developments is professional emergency manager Ken Jenkins. Part of Ken's business deals with air disasters and people affected by them. Ken, thanks for your time.
You're welcome, Dan. Thank you.
Great. So let's take this piece by piece. Lubitz apparently told Lufthansa that he had depression before he became a pilot. The airline said at first they knew nothing about his depression. Your reaction?
Well, I am surprised that they said that they didn't know anything about it and then later said that they did, considering how forthcoming they had been up until that point. So the contradiction certainly is interesting. The question that I have, and I haven't heard anybody ask it or make that connection yet, is the doctors that the co-pilot was seeing prior to the accident, were those tied with the airline or were those his own private physicians, in which case that information from those physicians would never have been shared with the airline, and that might be where we have this disconnect in terms of how much did the airline really know versus just the initial depression bout when he joined the company.
Mm-hmm. And it also turns out that Lubitz had also been treated for suicidal tendencies before becoming a pilot. Do you think the airline asked him about that when he told them about his depression episodes?
Well, you know, yes, I do, and if not, they should have. Is that would be part of any pre-employment and medical clearance. And typically with most carriers, most air carriers, it's a very rigorous process to become a pilot outside of the technical aspect of flying and the number of hours you have to become a pilot. But the medical and the psychological items they have to go through are extensive. But it's usually after you're hired that the psychological aspect of that goes away. And, for example, within the United States, it becomes more of a self-reporting issue than it is something that is followed up on during your career.
You know, I was wondering about this because he told a girlfriend, an ex-girlfriend, that he would one day do something that he would be known for forever. Do you think he planned the crash for a long time?
You know, I don't know. I'm not a mental health care expert. I don't think I'm the best qualified to answer that. I think we're all pretty convinced at this point that there's a history of mental health issues for this young man that you know, ended with this accident. How well in advance did he actually plan it? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. We're talking to professional emergency manager Ken Jenkins. This is Florida Live. I'm Dan Maduri. The other issue with Lubitz is his eyesight. He apparently had some kind of problem. He thought it was a detached retina, but others say it was psychosomatic and that he would have problems seeing clearly when he was stressed. Would his pilot license have been yanked in either case?
Well, it depends on through the medical certification process. I mean, what they're for Germany, for example, what are the ratios for eyesight? And when I say ratios, if you look at within the United States, and for your listeners and for you, and I pulled this before the interview today, the federal air regulation regarding the medical certificate is actually on the Internet through the FAA. It doesn't mean that what we do in the United States is the same for Germany, but there are parameters by which you have to be able to see, whether it's 20/20 or near vision of 20/40. There's color perception, a number of things, aspects of it. So depending on what his condition was with regarding to the eyesight, it may have been enough to not yank his certificate, but pull him from flying for a medical condition until that eyesight condition improved. If it didn't improve or it was going to be long-term, then yes, it could have been possibly pulled at that point, his certificate to fly.
Are there mental evaluations for U.S. and European pilots?
There are in the pre-employment process, as we mentioned, and for U.S. pilots within the United States, it is through pre-employment, but it's never really discussed in depth on, let's say, every 6 months or 12 months, depending on the medical you're on, your medical certificate when it's renewed. A doctor may say, here are a list of questions. Have you been treated for depression? Here's a list, and you can either check yes or no, and it's about self-reporting. If you don't report it, then it's not discussed.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier the rigors of the training process to become a pilot, also the stress and strain it puts on family relationships in being currently an active pilot. With that in mind, is mental illness a big problem for pilots?
Well, in terms of knowing how many folks, pilots, are clinically depressed or whatnot, I couldn't share if it's a widespread issue or not. I would venture to say that through the screening process that the United States has, and that a number of pilots come through the military, they're vetted certainly in very difficult conditions there, and then they come to work for commercial airlines. Another aspect of how difficult it is to become a pilot, particularly within the United States, is the number of hours to be flown, which is 1,500 hours. And part of that stress, Dan, comes from the financial aspect of a co-pilot, for example, has to have 1,500 hours. They have to pay for that training and flight time themselves. And so unless they're being subsidized through some kind of educational system or through a program where you're going to have a conditional employment policy, a lot of that is their expense. It's like going for your PhD and having to take out school loans. So you get a lot of stress there as well. But then it should be all vetted through how well they fly, the rigors of the testing that they go through, their educational background, and then, of course, their medical certificate and psychological background checks before they're hired. So I don't see this as, and I'm kind of caught here. I heard a psychologist being interviewed the other day, and she said, in her words, this is not a high risk within the aviation industry. I mean, throughout aviation, the known cases where we're absolutely sure we think it was a pilot that brought a plane down is less than 5 times. And while that sounds good on one hand, that it's very small, I look at it from unless you're the family member in the aftermath of that disaster, it doesn't matter how many times. Ask one of those 150 families that are being impacted by this Germanwings accident. It doesn't matter to them that this is only the 5th time that it's happened. Their loved one's gone.
And let's talk about the families of those killed in the crash. Usually we can point to a mechanical issue or a pilot error when a plane crashes. Will it be tougher for relatives to square the cause of this crash because of why it happened?
For some, it will be, and I say for some, and that's because there's such a wide spectrum, Dan, as to how people integrate a disaster into their lives. But I contacted a colleague of mine that lost her brother in an aviation disaster 20 years ago in Roselawn, Indiana, and she's now a clinical social worker, and she works in a trauma unit at a hospital. And I asked her how she felt about knowing that the pilot or co-pilot deliberately brought the plane down. And she said, I'm just as sickened and shocked as everybody else is. She said, but I would share with you that many families are going to look at this and say at least they have an answer. They know what happened. They know the co-pilot did it. It doesn't mean that they're ready to go on with their lives, but they don't have to wait for that year-long investigation or 2-year investigation to find out that mechanical nuance that occurred that brought the plane down. She said compare that to the family members of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 that don't have an answer to their question. And in that respect, at least they have an answer.
That's a great point, brilliant point. We're talking professional emergency manager Ken Jenkins. Is there anything you see that might change here in America to assure no similar disasters happen here?
Well, what I would hope to see, and I think we're going to see, and the discussion certainly is there right now, is the cockpit door, the reinforced cockpit door technology may be enhanced to a way that there's, and they certainly are good reinforced doors, and that they did keep somebody out like they're supposed to, but it kept the wrong person out. Is how do we change the technology or amend the technology to where somebody that needs to get in can get in, whether it's from a ground-to-air mechanism or it's a two-person code that's entered. The flight attendant has a code, the pilot has a code, which can bypass anything in the cockpit. I'm not sure what it will be, but I think we're going to see that discussed and new prototypes being created. And I also think that we're going to see an enhanced look at the psychological aspect of the medical certificate. There are a lot of questions about, well, there's a lot of costs and it doesn't, can it effectively screen? But I think it does no good not to do anything. At least it's another deterrent if it is being screened and looked at.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your time. Professional Emergency Manager Ken Jenkins, thanks for taking the time and joining us here on the program.
You're welcome, Dan. Thank you for having me.
All right, you take care.